Luciferians, they have an object. They're heading towards it, talking about meta-system transitions and organic computers and whatever. They got all the lingo. One group that's heavy involved in this is known as Principia Cybernetica, with these two creatures. And their basic ideology is, again, to evolve, and they call it, their work is evolving a self-adjusting, self-improving machine. But they also speak in, it might not sound it right away, but they're speaking in occult or metaphysical terminology. This is what always fascinates me. They talk about moving towards what's known as an omega point. Well, omega in occult symbolism is Lucifer or Satan. You can choose whichever one, because that's not me saying that, that's official Christian theology. Alpha is Christ, omega is the antithesis. And omega is often used as a moniker for the devil, for the tempter. And these Jesuit-backed technocrats, techno-elites, are moving, as in their own words, towards this omega point. Their terms are like a meta-system transition towards the global brain. It's just Dr. Frankensteinian pipe dreams. If anyone who's followed my Atlantis work, and they know about the alien blood, and I say that we all have it, but some people are far more oriented towards it. Well, they got to keep busy too. That alien part of us needs to keep busy. The thing is, they get busy with millions of dollars behind them. That's why it's dangerous. I didn't mind if they play in their sandbox and leave everybody alone. Carry on. But this is another one. This Stephen Thaler, I just took one clip of this nonsense. Go on to Google and YouTube and type this in. I have the name from somewhere. Stephen Thaler, and he does this whole routine. And just turn down the volume and watch the amount of occult symbolism he uses with his hands and his body language. Then turn it up and listen to the same thing he's doing with his dialogue, right? It's all pseudo-mystical rhetoric laced with subliminal references to collective consciousness and to the global intelligence. Sounds all very highfalutin. One of the quotes he uses towards the end as he's building up this occult message, there's a line in which he says, "There is an alien consciousness all around us." It's embedded in there, right? And then he describes himself as a... Remember I said that the technocrats have taken over from a religion? He says it himself. He says, "I place myself between Darwin and creationism." Weren't these guys at loggerheads? Weren't these guys having pillow fights for the last hundreds of years? And now they reinvent themselves and says, yeah... What they're doing is taking the baton from where religion left off. They're very religious. They're very esoteric. They're very mystical. Very full of occultism. The body language alone is repulsive, what this character is doing, to attract your subconscious to what he's doing. Yeah, it's called in its image. Its image. It's in our face every day. If you look at advertisements like this, of which I have many, but we can only look at one. Connecting people. It sounds marvelous. Half the people who work for Nokia think that's great. That's their meme. They have dreams about that. They have that on their t-shirts and on their walls. They have mugs and goblets and ties and pins and number plates. Not one of them thinking, what does the word connecting imply? What are connected? There's a lot of stuff connected around here. What is it? It's not relating people. It's connecting people. Look at this. It's doublespeak. You connect gadgets. You connect machines. And you connect a bunch of self-murdered automatons, pseudo-cells. They get connected. There are many fallacies of scientism. I'll be dealing with them. I have dealt with them in the Disciples of Mysterium article, but working on a larger thesis there. A few we can only mention. That human and nature are distinct entities. That's the Cartesian fallacy. I'm here in my armchair and there's this thing, Rex Extensa, called the world. It's out there somewhere. And I'm going to analyze it from my armchair with my reason. And that and me. The big one, nature and man are imperfect. So, fix the imperfections. A very important one, less known, but a very important one, is in the future man will know perfection. That's how they smuggle in the collectivism. Because obviously every scientist, either consciously or non-consciously, imagines himself as a test tube passing on the baton. Even an Einstein would admit that I am only one Einstein, I can't live forever. So it's a given that in science, One scientist is somewhat anonymous. You have the little pop star celebrity types, but mostly it's anonymous scientists working in a chain of command, passing on the work to others, right? What that means that no one individual has the whole truth. We need the whole group. And under that idea that we're moving towards progress towards perfection, but it's a chain reaction, that you can't individually know perfection inside. Preposterous mystical nonsense, they'll say. But we will know it collectively and through a continuum of scientists who all focus on that goal and that light. A much more philosophical and ultimately disastrous one to their lie. The whole of science can be brought down by the philosopher we touched on earlier, Hume, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, never to be mentioned, because his critique back in the 17th century still stands, by the way, and has only been strengthened by the discoveries of the quantum scientists. And that is that cause and effect, there's no connection between them scientifically provable at all. It was more deep and elaborate than that, but we can't go into it. But it's called the causality problem, showing that the connections between a cause and effect are purely hypothetical, and that even though legions of scientists from Hume's time have worked overnight, both in mathematics and geometry and astrophysics and whatever else, to try and find, especially in the mathematical world, to find that certainty, the four greatest mathematicians who set their minds to do it went insane. Some committed suicide and the rest were locked up. That's what happens when you're trying to find a backdoor into reality. Because what they can never understand is that there is no certainty in that way. The life, the world that you look at, the natural order that you look at changes as you look at it. It's a constant dance. It's a constant ballet. You look, you change. It changes from your looking. It's a constant ebb and flow, a constant, spontaneous, mutable thing that can never have an Archimedean point. So the certainty that they thought they were going to find obviously didn't come. And that caused a ruckus, a major meltdown from which arose Gaia theory and quantum theory and so many other theories. More fascinating, obviously. But here they are talking about the promises of complete understanding, collectivism, the future will know perfection, with record rates of depression and suicide all around the world. What's the reality? It's ludicrous. Really. Anthony Stevens in the 2 million-year-old self says, as educated members of Western society, we share a number of common assumptions. One of these is that we are potentially capable of knowing everything that is knowable. I talked about this in one of the talks I did. It's up on my Unslaved YouTube channel. It was done in California a year ago, I think, where I said, one life to live, infinite things to know. Obviously, something's wrong with that picture, and these are radical rethink. Because either you have to say, then I am a single individual is incapable of knowing everything, that's the easy way out. Or you say, no. Like the Taoists and others have said, everything that is knowable can be known. But obviously not through a scientific or rational process. You can divide mankind into two, which one you believe. But it is a certainty that with one life to live and infinite things to know, we don't have the physical time. It can't be done in time. Now, we are shaken out of this illusion only when we begin to push knowledge to its limits and ask such questions as, is knowledge and how can we know anything? What is knowledge and how can we know anything? What existed before the universe came into being? Unanswerable. What is the essence of all creation? Why does anything exist at all? When we pose questions like this, the possibility begins to dawn on us that there may be things that lie beyond our capacity to grasp, know, or even imagine, let alone understand. What he's talking about there we'll look at more deeply in the solution section. I want you to remember this one because he's implying, he doesn't say it, a kind of humility, a kind of littleness. Now when you say the word littleness in English, it doesn't sound very good. But it is kind of a Clint Eastwood, a man must know his limitations kind of thing. And there's something very beautiful about it we'll explore later on. It's a humility and a littleness, but a grand and brilliant and beautiful littleness. We'll look at that later on. This section is vitally important to introduce something we just touched on in the past, but is central to my entire thesis. People who are taking notes might even want to say this is the thesis. We'll summarize them at the end, but this is one of the most important. We've been talking about the ancestral trauma, and we've been trying to talk about the etiology of the kind of evil and dysfunction that we see in the world today. We jumped over something monumentally important, which helps psychologists also. In normal psychology, most neurosis and pathology is tracked back to, obviously, anxiety. In fact, as you read, anxiety being, as Freud said, the center of all neurosis. But they're often more specific about it in daily life, and they link most neurosis back to shame and guilt. I didn't talk about it earlier because it wasn't the place. Guilt is the emotion that we feel, or the mood that we experience when we've done a physical, perceivable, documentable misdemeanor against somebody or something. We feel guilt. Shame is not the same thing. Shame is the emotion that you feel when you and only you know that you have not lived up to your highest potential. In other words, that you've lived the inauthentic life. Now, they're very colored differently. But when you go back and take in the prehistoric, so many of the people within the scientific movement and psychoanalytical movement have no interest whatsoever. It's right at the top of my Disciples' Mysterium, first paragraph. I make this point, that these people have never factored in any of the stuff that we're talking about when we talk about prehistoric disaster, and they bloody well should do. Because one thing it will do is it will show you what the true etiology of neurosis and pathology is. It's not to say that shame and guilt are not involved. Person not living an inauthentic life, of course they're going to be in shame of that. Person does physical misdemeanors, of course they're going to be in guilt about that. But the real origins, the real seed of the tree, inverted, rotten tree of life of all pathology, goes further back to a thing that I describe as the antipathy to nature. And it's born out of the trauma. When nature erupted around our forebears, nature that was, relatively speaking, it's not that other cataclysms hadn't happened in the past, but for long tracts of time, people grew to respect nature, as we know our ancestors did. But when the titanic upheavals happened, obviously one of the after effects of that was a great and deep suspicion of nature itself. A breach had taken place. One can even read it in the fall of from the Edenic plain. That Mother Nature now had a dark side and was terribly threatening because of the horror and the cataclysm that had happened. It's the same thing today that happens when people, if they have like I grew up in Belfast, I can tell you all about it. These bomb attacks and scares, you see this all the time. Well, that kind of trauma magnified many times. Entered in and became a primal instinct. It became a primal drive within us, at the seat of our ego consciousness, a deep antipathy to nature itself. Over and above that, we still have an aesthetic appreciation, a fascination, a biological interest in animals. That's all overlaid on top of something. In our mythologies, the flood myth, and all of these other myths, there's a lot of this other pathology involved, right? Of course, it's non-conscious. But it is to be now considered, I believe, now this should be considered the root of all psychological derangement. Why are we talking about it in the section on scientism and technology? Because technology and scientism is one of the main symptoms of that pathology. You couldn't have technology and science as we know it today, being so ecocidal and so super rational and so anti-human, if this antipathy to nature did not exist. That's why the two are so divided. Whereas there's been many scientists who blended them together. We know their names. Also, globalism is a fulfillment. Globalism, to live inside the hive, to live inside an incarcerated Blake 7 hideous, air-conditioned dome. Glass buildings, armor, plate, glass to keep you away from nature. It's all rooted in it. And it was the calamity of the old world order that changed us. We felt like we were cast out of the garden. And we were infected with a deep, non-conscious suspicion toward nature. And for those who are already getting what I'm saying, when you see that nature and the self are one, look what the implication is. Infection with suspicion towards nature is infection and suspicion towards oneself. Another layer of pathology. And we'll talk about that in the solution section, because of what to do, how to unravel this knot. Because unless this knot is unraveled, this pathology, solving the guilt-shame number will help you, but it's not going to radically change civilization. It's just moving the furniture around. To fix the civilization, we have to go much deeper. But this is the fall. The fall, the true mythology of the fall is connected to this. The fall away from nature. Remember we said that you can junk the memory, but not the effects? The effects are large, hideous, big. Even so many movies deal with this, by the way. All those Poseidon Adventure, Charlton Heston stuff, even movies like The Fountain. You'll see this image in the Conan the Barbarians. Every movie you look at that is worth its salt you will see this. Remember the story of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and the elves, how they never lost the connection? I was saying the movie, I mean the book, of course. The man knew what he was talking about how our societies are divided, with those with a deep antipathy to nature and those who are one with it still, the very few, the last of the line. Max Frisch says that technology, yeah, it's the knack of so arranging the world you don't have to experience it. Nutshell. The divorce from nature is ultimately the divorce from self. We're alienated from both of them. And we become more mechanical in our thought as a result. In a great article, and I believe it's in the Reality Sandwich website, Caitlin McGrory says that a new study funded by the NIH and the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke involved subjects having their brains hooked up to a computer displaying two images. And through thought control, the subjects were able to make the computer display one image and discard the other. The technologizing of consciousness. How to fuse the man and the machine together. Constant research on that. E.F. Schumacher, the system of nature of which man is a part tends to be self-balancing, self-adjusting, self-cleansing. Not so with technology. The technical term for it is negentropia. Nature isn't plugged in. But there it is. There's the energy. The suns are burning, the stars are burning, the leaves are growing, but there's no socket. Our bodies grow and so on. So it's called a negentropia. Self-sustaining. What I'm trying to emphasize is that can you please try to go into the mind of the... Try to think like Sherlock Holmes said, think in the terms of the criminal. Can you imagine being offended and deeply, deeply threatened by the negentropia around you? Can you be threatened by the fact that you can't find the source of the energy and the power, and that you rival it? And then in some sort of Dr. Frankenstein way, you're seeking all the time for that plug. Well, that is what the scientism is all about. Rivalry, born out of what we're talking about. It's overwhelmingly obsessive. Remember we said that when we talk about the Umwelt, you can only adjust to it? Well, the scientist is not merely trying to adjust to it, is he? He is desperately trying to control it. But how does he control it? Destructively. Our attitude to the world outside us is largely hostile. We're forever conquering nature, space, mountains, deserts, bacteria, and insects instead of learning to cooperate with them in a harmonious order. In America, the great symbols of this conquest are the bulldozer and the rocket, the instrument that batters the hills to flat tracks for little boxes made of ticky-tacky, and the great phallic projectile that blasts the sky. A big game hunter here, a big Tarzan, he says there's nothing more satisfactory than the complete flop of a running elephant shot in the brain. It's a pity the elephant doesn't have the gun. Remember that Crocodile Dundee thing with the kangaroo? How do you feel when he's, flopping down with a bullet in his brain? But this bestial antipathy is on a microscopic level and on a higher level as well. Rudolf Barrow says that exactly 100 years ago, the rate of dying out of biological species began to increase exponentially, as a result of which, in the mid-1980s, a species vanished every day. And by the year 2000, this will have increased to a species every hour. We have monopolized the earth for our species alone. Talk about antipathy to nature. Ken Wilber says we are at present exterminating approximately 100 species a day. We are destroying the world's tropical forests at the rate of 1 football field per second. The planet instead is headed for disaster, and it is now possible for the first time in human history that owing entirely to man-made circumstances, not one of us will survive to tell the tale. If the earth is indeed our body and blood, then in destroying it, we are committing a slow and gruesome suicide. How can that be explained if you don't have an antipathy to nature, where you're responding to what apparently was Earth's violence towards us, you see? Now, of course, he's wrong on one point. Nature isn't going anywhere. No matter how destructive what you do on this planet, nature is barely affected. It is man who's going to become extinct. Now, our present environmental crisis is due primarily to a fractured worldview that drastically separates mind and body, subject and object, culture and nature, thoughts and things, values and facts, spirit and matter, human and non-human. A worldview that is dualistic, mechanistic, atomistic, anthropocentric, and pathologically hierarchical. A broken worldview that alienates men and women from the intricate web of patterns and relationships that constitute the very nature of life and Earth and cosmos. Thing is, people have described that in umpteen books, but they never explain why. Why do we do it? Paul Shepard, in A Kind of Madness, says the change to a more hostile stance towards nature began about 5,000 and 10,000 years ago and became more destructive and less accountable with the progress of civilization. In hindsight, this change has been explained in terms of necessity or as a decline of ancient gods. But more likely, it was irrational and unconscious, a kind of failure in some fundamental dimension of human existence, a kind of madness. So some people are questioning what it is. Theodore Roszak, he says that the Atmospheric Science Research Center of Scotia, New York, reported in December 1969 that there was no longer a breath of uncontaminated air to be found anywhere in the North American hemisphere, and predicted that universal use of artificial respirators throughout America within 2 decades. Thor Heyerdahl, sailing the Atlantic on the Ra II expedition of 1970, reported finding that one oil-free stretch of water during the crossing. James Bell says that the World Conservation Union, the International Botanical Congress, and a majority of the world's biologists believe that a global mass extinction already is underway. As a direct result of human activity, up to 1/5 of all living species, mostly in the tropics, are expected to disappear within 30 years. The speed at which species are being lost is much faster than any we've seen in the past, including those related to meteor collisions. University of Tennessee biodiversity expert Daniel Simberloff told the Washington Post, or that's what he told them, and in 1998, Harris poll of 5,000 members of the American Institute of Biological Sciences found 70% believed that what has been termed the 6th extinction is now underway. Right? Inner violence, inner dysfunction and mutilation, obviously, will manifest externally. So what's the alternative? Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, was one of the most extreme opponents of the scientism and technological, along with Ponty. His replacement for it, the relationship that we should be having with nature, he referred to as sorge, which is just basically translated as care. And it's born out of the idea that, of course, you understand that there's no division between you and nature. Eigenwelt is itself a product of the Umwelt, of nature. And primarily, as we'll see in solutions, this antipathy to nature absolutely must be healed. Meaning that each individual must know how to go and do something about it. And hopefully, we'll go into that. Out of this nonsense, not just you have scientism, but you've got this perversity of asceticism. It's bloody infantile. Oh, nature, yeah, evil, right? Got to transcend it. Give me a technique and a guru. Strangling in the webs in our efforts to be free. Agents in our own bloody annihilation. It's almost comedic if it wasn't so bloody sad, right? But the point is that information obviously isn't knowledge or wisdom. We talked about the fact that there's a massive difference between the need to gain knowledge and have knowledge and the relationship that you have with knowledge or wisdom. First of all, as we said, a computer cannot function according to its own will. It doesn't turn itself on and off, and it can't change and decide to do different than what it's programmed to do, whereas a human being does that all the time. But the thing is that the programmed human being won't be able to do that. He will not be able to choose when he turns himself on and off, and he won't be able to make those choices. It's not about, when they talk about making those rhetoric about making the computer more like the human being, that's doublespeak. The only interest they have is making a human being more machine-like. That's been going from the time of John Dee onwards. It's part of a very serious pact. An unhealthy society is one which creates mutual hostility, distrust, which transforms man into an instrument of use and exploitation for others, which deprives him of a sense of self, except in as much as he submits to others or becomes an automaton. Lewis Mumford says that by his very success in inventing labor-saving devices, modern man has manufactured an abyss of boredom that only the privileged classes in earlier civilizations have ever fathomed. And Eric Fromm says that Emil Durkheim, a sociologist, called this phenomenon anomie and found that it was the main cause of suicide, which had been increasing with the growth of industrialization. Right? He referred by anomie to the destruction of all traditional social bonds due to the fact that all truly collective organization had become secondary to the state and that all genuine social life had been annihilated. He believed that people living in a modern political state are a disorganized dust of individuals. That's the reality. The collectivism is all the talismanic nonsense. But those pieces of dust feel like a stone if they galvanize together, don't they? And all this guy Durkheim is really saying is that the dehumanizing process, which is age-old, has been super successful. The one thing Susan Sontag said I do agree with is that reality has come to seem more and more like what we're shown by cameras. Well, then it's not reality then anymore, is it? Many people have asked me about that in the work on symbolism, and my answer partly is always the same, is that we've been gutted and raped of our archetypal reservoir, so they give it back. All that welter of sexual and symbolic, all the symbolism, the color, the occult symbolism, is basically a feeding of us what we've been raped from within. That's why we're actually attracted to it. It's just not a reality anymore, it's a virtual reality. That media stuff is to offset total psychological breakdown, because they know better than anyone that you can only rape the consciousness of people to a certain degree. You can't do it completely, then you have a pathological creature on your hands. So, hence the bread and circuses, which is